All right. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the College of Architecture's 2020-2021 lecture series. This is going to be a year-long lecture series, and it's titled Calibrations, the Space of Practice. It's been formed to address and promote the expanded spaces of architectural practice regarding critical issues of diversity and inclusivity. It's a response to a still unfolding set of events surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement, but also builds upon a dramatic set of nationwide conversations, long overdue, and often initiated by students of architecture, including students within the College of Architecture at TTU. The somewhat informal lecture committee is made up of myself, Assistant Professor Ursula Kripa, and visiting lecturer Stephanie Sang Delgado. Also involved in the selection of the speakers was the College of Architecture's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as faculty, students, and staff involved with that committee. The series will focus on three plural sets of practices: practices of architecture, practices of community building, and practices of context. Practices of architecture, the way that architects employ and engage a different set of practices to engage increasingly different and inclusive and issues of inclusivity. The practice of community building through inclusion, representation of minority voices, and practices of context making. That is the reframing of architectural narratives to create inclusive contexts for design. Individuals from the university, college faculty, and student body will act as moderators for each lecture. Lectures will be synchronous and will partner with both the Lubbock and El Paso campuses in a deliberate attempt to bring both campuses together in a larger dialogue. Our lecturers this afternoon will be Germane Barnes and Shahin Roudbari. And the title of their lecture is The Cape and the Cowl, Architectures of Vigilantism. The moderator for the lecture and panel discussion will be Stephanie Sangalo, visiting lecturer here at TTU and co-director of Office CA. Stephanie will be monitoring questions that come into the chat space, so please feel free to submit questions during or after the lecture and panel discussion. We will be joined by two panelists at the end of the lecture: Anjuli Rao, a Chicago-based journalist and editor of Chicago Architect magazine, and Galo Canizares, visiting lecturer here at TTU and author of the recent Digital Fabrications, Design Stories for a Software-Based Planet. And now a few words about this afternoon's speakers. Germane Barnes is assistant professor and director of the Community Housing and Identity Lab, CHIL, at the University of Miami. Born in Chicago, Germane received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana and a Master of Architecture from Woodbury University, where he is awarded the Thesis Prize for his project Symbiotic Territories: Architectural Investigations of Race, Identity, and Community. Barnes' research and design practice investigates the connection between architecture and identity, learning from historical data and perspectives from within architecture, as well as cultural and ethnic studies. He examines how the built environment influences the social and cultural experience. He's also designer in residence for the Opa Loca Community Development Corporation, where his design and research contributions have been published and exhibited in several international publications and institutions, most notably Curb.com, where he was named member of the 2015 class of Young Guns, under the radar professionals who are busy challenging the status quo of the design industry. Shahin Rudbari is assistant professor of environmental design at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He received his BS in Civil Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, an MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Cornell, and both his MS and PhD in Architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. He studies the way design and planning practitioners around the world shape their political and professional power. In doing so, he brings institutional and transnational perspectives to the ways architects, planners, and engineers tackle social and environmental justice. Shawhin is drawn to qualitative and mixed methods approaches in sociology and contemporary history. He applies these in tracking global connections of people, policies, and practices, be they formal, informal, even underground or illegal. He studies contentious political engagement by design professionals through in-depth interviews, participant observation, and analyzing texts. He investigates the ways dissenters shape and mobilize power towards justice causes. While the focus of his work is on emerging activist groups and coalitions of his designers, his research has led him to study community-engaged design as activism and counter-hegemonic movements by professionals. I'm pleased to welcome Germane, Shawhin, and Anjali to the College of Architects at TTU, and to once again introduce Stephanie and Gallo. I'll now turn this virtual podium over to Germane and Shawhin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And Germane and I are really excited to be here. We've been kind of riding on a high for the past couple of weeks with the opportunity to kick off this lecture series. And for us, it's also a kickoff for, I guess, a tour around this Vigilantism special issue of Moss Context that's coming out next spring. And just the opportunity to have this conversation with TTU community, with Anjali and Gallo as well, has been really exciting for us. So we're happy to be here. Thanks for having us over. I'm going to start with a quote, and Germane's going to pop that up on the second slide. And while that's up, this will be a way of testing this Q&A system. I'll read this, and I'm going to ask if you all can take a stab at where you think this is coming from or what the context of this is. Do show yourself friendly at the counter at all times. Do sit straight and always face the counter. Don't strike back or curse back if attacked. Don't laugh loud. Don't hold conversations. Don't block entrances. So I'm going to give you all a second and pull up the Q&A. If you can find it and navigate to it, take a moment and let us know if you have an idea of what this is about. Yes. Yeah, great. Great. Yeah, I'm getting some thoughts in, and y'all are spot on. So this is from the sit-ins, and these were instructions that SNCC was providing to participants in organizing these sit-ins at lunch counters as a form of protest during this kind of leading up to the civil rights movement. And this is in Howard Zinn's account of the sit-ins. And what I wanted to bring our attention to here is sort of the way everyday spaces and spaces as mundane as lunch counters become politicized. And the reason they become politicized, we believe, is rooted in their institutional history. And in the US, there's a specific white institutional history of exclusion, of segregation, of violence, and ultimately racism, forms of racism that are embedded in not extraordinary spaces of racism, such as, say, slave quarters or slave ships, where I think those forms of racism are more obvious and more blatant, but inherent in even things like lunch counters, even the entrances to the store within which these lunch counters were located. And to me, this statement, these set of instructions to the protesters is loaded with significance. As architects, I just speaking for myself, struggle with thinking about how a space can be racist in itself, not just the users of the space, not just the designers of the space or critics of the space, but the physical and material aspects of the space. How are they manifestations of a racism? How do they code our architecture and our spaces, our everyday spaces, sidewalks, lunch counters, with a certain kind of politics? Hop to the next slide, Germane, if you don't mind. And to show in one of our research groups, this is a collage put together by one of my students, Ana Colón Quiñones. She's creating a collage of a prison space, and she's taking a rendering by another architect and putting in different elements that code this space or make visible the coding of racism in overt spaces of racism, such as prisons. And here, you know, we have many histories, sociological studies of institutional racism that are present in prisons from, again, speaking to architectural elements, when we learn about the panopticon and ways spaces are controlled and policed and way power is exerted through the gaze. And in this case, you could see the guards on that bridge across the two buildings at the top, to tape markers on the floor that limit and guide inmates' movement, almost as a metaphorical echo of the ways the movement of black and brown bodies are policed in outside prisons. They're done so very overtly within prisons. And this stands in contrast to how we as architects imagine and design prisons, almost with this utopian idea or this almost, say, neutral sense of the racial history and context of prisons. So if you look at the silhouettes to the right of what we imagine as sort of repentant inmates doing their exercises and calisthenics during their break, and then going back and reflecting on their sins and hopefully becoming, hopefully experiencing the forms of neutral and vanilla punishment that we think these systems embody. The reality is very different. And this set of collages are meant to visualize some of that overt institutional racism that we see in prisons. Can we have to the next slide, Germane? But what we struggle with, and I personally struggle with still, is to understand those same forms of racism in spaces, institutional spaces like this. This is a classroom in a law school. You see a lot of elements of courtrooms here, different tables for the defendants, plaintiffs, the judge, the jury, the person on the stand, but also the audience. And what we're considering, and really building off the work of a handful of sociologists, one is Wendy Leo Moore. She has this a really great book called Reproducing Racism. Another is Joyce Bell at the University of Chicago. And what they tell us is that these buildings and these spaces are not designed in a way that's independent from the history of racism in the US, specifically anti-Black racism. The whole institution of law, America's legal system, was built in its history to support landowning elite at the expense of Black enslaved bodies. And that has been codified into the laws, but then also into the institutions of law school, where certain ways of knowing about rights, about law, about legal process are encoded with those same forms of racism. And that is expressed and exhibited in the architecture of these spaces. If you think about hierarchy, if you think about circulation, if you think about the panoptic gaze or the omnioptic gaze, as Carrie Costello talks about in these rooms, these spaces are not neutral. We can't think about them through a colorblind lens. Can we hop to the next slide, Germane? And so what this brings up for us are a set of questions around really the hegemony, or the hegemonic nature of whiteness, how embedded this domination of this white worldview is in all our everyday spaces, going back to those lunch counter sit-ins. And this is, you know, a housing project. Again, the background rendering is by somebody else. The collage is by Anna. The silhouettes in here, the entourage, are sort of ways we tend to imagine the use of these spaces as apolitical and as colorblind as architects. But the elements that she's added for the white family up front, but also the vigilante encounter, kind of Jim Crow era policing a little bit in the midground, all seek to make visual and represent to us ways these everyday spaces are part of an institutional history of racism that we can't ignore. And if we do ignore them, we're perpetuating racism through colorblindness. Next slide, please. And so this is just a quick snapshot of an exhibit that we did with our research group last year, trying to explore this question, in rendering spaces colorblind, how do we frame racism in architecture? And we played with a series of these collages and juxtaposed them over excerpts from poetry, from memoir, and from sociology, accounts of ways people experience racism in these spaces, because for a majority of us, the intensity and the violence of racism in these spaces is either invisible or safe to ignore, but for many people, they're present, violent, and overwhelming. And we'll hop to the last slide, I think, or maybe this was my last slide. Yeah, so I'll just transition here, and I'll say that exhibit came out of a conversation that we had a year ago today, actually, at a conference at Stanford University, ACSA conference, Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, where a bunch of us on this call were, and where a bunch of us met. And in a panel that I had, we were exploring the same question about what are those everyday spaces of racism, and how can we confront them as architects? How can we represent them? How do we render them, literally and figuratively? And just before that session, I was at this amazing session where I met Germane, which you see pictured here. And I'll pass it over to him to tell you a little bit about that.
Thank you, Shahin. And first I want to say thank you to Texas Tech for the invitation and to give us the opportunity to talk about the Vigilantism issue for mass context. And so what you see in front of you is the patio of Stanford University during the fall ACSA conference, Let's Talk More Action. And if you guys want to play a game of Where's Waldo, if you look on the left side of the screen, somewhere you will find Shahin. And additionally, if you look on the right side of the screen, somewhere you will find Professor Ursula, who was also there at the session. And so the idea behind the session was essentially the ways in which architectural education fails a subset of its individuals, those primarily being individuals who identify as BIPOC. And so the core idea behind the session was that a lot of the tools that were given within architecture isn't made for everyone. And so we took the idea of the dinner table, because they asked us for non-traditional means of conversation and interrogation. And so I took just traditional cutlery, knife, fork, spoon, and then began to augment them to sort of show that if you're someone who identifies as Mexican or as indigenous or as Black or as a woman, you might find it much more difficult to use everyday objects within architecture. And then those numbers that are on it also identify some of the failures of architecture education, such as the amount of women who are within architecture, the amount of indigenous faculty within architecture, the amount of Black faculty in architecture, the amount of Black directors and deans, the amount of female deans. So just trying to show that architecture has a long way to go. And I think one of the biggest accelerators of this happened during this pandemic with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests. And so this is actually taken in Miami while the protest was happening. A good friend of mine is a photographer, and he was out there for 3 or 4 days taking photographs of everything. And I think this is important because each of us within academia, whether we want to accept it or not, holds some sort of privilege. And that's not something that's indicative of where you're from economically, but just the fact that you're able to go to a university, that is a privilege. That is something that not everyone has access to. That's not something everyone has. The fact that you're here and you're participating in this lecture and you have a computer that you can use, or a cell phone or a laptop or an iPad, you are privileged. And to be privileged gives a ridiculous amount of responsibility to understand that those who are not should not be looked down upon, should be encouraged, should be brought to a situation to where they're at an equitable level as you. Like, there's nothing wrong with someone else having the same resources that you have. In fact, we should be encouraging others to have the same resources that we have. And so I want to put that into context of what I'm currently practicing and teach in University of Miami and living within Miami, Florida. What you're looking at is a map, a historic map of the locations of where those who identified as Black were forced to live within the city during the Jim Crow era, right? So all those Black locations you see are what are identified as Black Miami. None of those locations are close to the water. None of those locations are on Miami Beach. That's intentional. As Shahin mentioned before, the way that we inhabit space, the way the space is distributed, it all has a set of rules and underlying tensions that have to be acknowledged. The way that we plan, the way we as architects understand urbanism, we are complicit within a lot of the issues and the ills that we see within the world, and it's our job to undo those. It's our job to fix those things. It's our job to listen to constituents and understand that we do not know everything. We do not have to be saviors. We just need to listen. And we can use our design skill sets, we can use our people skill sets, we can use our speaking to help advocate for those with design, through design. Because now those locations that you see on here that Black people were restricted to are now under siege, specifically because they're at a level above sea level, which makes them less prone to flooding. And now those privileged individuals who lived on the beach and was able to reap tons of financial resources are now trying to take those locations because they are not flooding and are not at risk of climate gentrification. And so we talk about the way the space is done theoretically, right? But there's also actual tools of oppression. And what you're looking at now are what's called racial ID cards. So in Miami during the 60s, if you were a Black person, you could not go to the beach unless you were a worker. So we get into issues of labor, we get into issues of gender, and this restriction of not even sundown town or when it's nighttime. It's specifically, are you here to do work for me? If not, you are not allowed on this beach at all. And so this is an example of that, right? So I showed you the Black Miami map, and now you're understanding that access was even more restricted unless you was a person who was doing some sort of work within the area. And so it takes us to the last slide, which is sort of how we got to this issue of vigilantism. Shahin and I, after we finished meeting, would have these sort of weekly calls on Zoom where we just talk about things happening in the world. And I don't know if you all remember, but there were all of these incidents like Barbecue Betty and Key Fob Kelly and kind of all these names that were individuals who were policing space. And so just off the hand, one conversation, I said, Shahin, I wish these people would stop trying to be Batman. Like, I really wish they would just stop. Like, it's not that big of a deal. You don't own this building. Why do you care so much? You don't own this park. Why do you care so much? And the bigger thing is we always saw the same dynamic. It was always Black bodies being policed by someone white. That was just consistent every single time. And so it became this sort of fascination that we have with vigilance and vigilantism, and the idea that in popular culture, the vigilante is celebrated. Everyone wants to be Superman. Everyone wants to be Spider-Man. But in practice, in real life, in application, it has significant harm to a certain subset of individuals. So that said, I will introduce you to two of the panelists who will be contributors to this issue of mass context. First up is Anjali Rao, followed by Gallo Canizares. So Anjali, you're up.
Great, super. So the piece that I'm currently working on for this issue about vigilante architecture, vigilantism, sort of deals with this idea of disorientation. So in my mind, this essay is sort of working itself into be kind of more of a narrative essay. Disorientation is the sensation of loss or unbelonging created by displacement or other political forces that disconnect us from the spaces that we attach ourselves and our identities to. And a lot of my work has really focused on the idea of feelings and architecture. And so I was really interested to explore the sensation of disorientation, but I was more excited to kind of inject this idea of vigilantism into how we can create spaces of belonging or spaces of disbelonging. And that kind of brought me back to some of my original research, thinking about landmarks and monuments, and how we can create a sense of belonging or a feeling of disbelonging or a feeling of disorientation using landmarks and monuments, understanding that both of them are highly politicized nature of monuments, the highly politicized nature of monuments, and then the kind of highly neutral presentation of landmarks within urban planning. So next slide, please. So I guess I started to ask myself, like, what is a landmark? And I thought way back to grad school, where I, read The Image of the City and sort of understood landmarks as being objects that one uses to orient themselves around the city, right? Like a landmark is something that says, this is where you are, and this is where you need to go, or this is what you need to do to get to where you're going. In historic preservation, however, the creation of a landmark is a political process with a different connotation. You would seek landmark status, or you would develop a landmark district. But those political processes are, in practice, highly exclusionary. And rarely marginalized communities are invited or involved in the process of making landmarks. Monuments function similarly. They sort of exist as monumental structures with which one can orient themselves around, but they sort of have a highly politicized nature, and they are also seeking to tell a history or a story that exists outside of that specific building. So, contrasting the landmarks to monuments, you see landmarks as being less political, though having political processes, and monuments being very political and sort of telling a broader story. So it was funny because I last year was interviewing Sue Mobley, who works for Colloquiate. She's a director there in New Orleans, and I was asking her about the difference between monuments and memorials. And the thing that she said to me was really interesting. She says, memorials remember something that was lost, but monuments assert the right to shape the future. So I started asking myself, how do we co-opt that definition or that language of a monument and apply it to landmarks, especially since landmarks are traditionally presented as apolitical objects of orientation? We're looking at issues of bureaucracy and opacity. We're looking at landmarks as being items or objects that are stamped and processed and permitted, all of the things that architects and designers sort of do behind closed doors. And I started to think to myself, next slide, that what if we started to be more expansive about the idea of what a landmark is? So to kind of co-opt that idea of a monument, we can expand the idea about a monument being an object that you would use to orient yourself. What if that object was used to orient the city to move into the future? What if that monument or that landmark was able to be created by the citizens, the residents of a neighborhood or a city, or even a block? And I'm thinking about a block in Chicago, in order to be able to assert the right to shape the future and that right of people to exist in that place. So this past summer, I was able to speak with Roberto Bedoya, who is the cultural affairs manager for the city of Oakland. And he spoke to me about something called place knowing or place keeping. Place knowing asks residents, who am I in relation to the land? Who am I in relation to this bench, to this sign, to this block, this bar? It asks residents to project themselves, to project their histories, their stories, and their identities on specific places. And that is sort of where I came to the idea that we should all be vigilantes and we should all be making monuments and landmarks to ourselves. So essentially this piece is a call. It's a call for people to make monuments to themselves, to their own histories and presences within a neighborhood, to ask themselves, who am I in relation to this space? It involves us to be more expansive about how we think about the idea of a landmark. And we can think of landmarks as being highly temporary, very noisy, or very quiet. My favorite example I like to give to people about landmarks, creating a landmark, is if you're like bumping music out of your car really loud. When the music leaves your car and it reverberates on the facades of the buildings around you, you essentially create a temporary landmark to your presence there. There are layers of the music, there's layers of who's doing it, the type of car that they're playing the music out of. It's asserting your right to be in that space and using the landscape around you to create a monument to yourself and your story and your presence. So I sort of, this my last slide, this is a picture of the front of my house, which when I moved in a year ago, it was painted what we call gentrification gray, which is like a really dark gray that most people know what I'm talking about. So I decided I wanted to paint it purple. And the reason for that is because, you know, as a narrative essay writer in this situation, I personally have had very little connection to my own history or my own place in the world. And I've only lived in Chicago for 8 years. And so this was my sort of way to project my own existence upon this building. And then on top of that, I live across the street from an elementary school. And so I like to think of landmarks, vigilante landmarks, as a gift, right? We give permission to others to create monuments to themselves or to their neighborhoods, to their own histories and cultures when we start to make that move. So for the kids across the street, they're not just going to school across the street from some buildings, they go to school across the street from the purple building. It's a way to orient themselves, and it's a way to mark a time in their lives, and it's a way to provide some type of visual and cultural orientation to little kids, to teenagers who take selfies in front of the purple because it's a great, great color, purple. But it's my sort of personal vigilante monument. And that's all I have.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much, Anjali. Gallo, you're up, my man.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shahin and Germane, for the invitation to both participate here, but also to contribute to the mass context issue. So we had a really interesting conversation over the summer when we were starting this, planning this issue, right? And when I thought of vigilantism, I immediately thought of these kind of grand narratives of destruction that, on the one hand, architects kind of love, and that maybe are not afforded to other individuals. So, for example, here, this is a project that I worked on a couple of years ago on architectural eschatologies, right? So these kind of monumental representations of destruction that are sort of prevalent in our discipline or disciplinary histories, right? So on the left, you've got a 3D representation of an Aldo Rossi drawing called L'Architecture Assassinée, the assassinated architecture, which famously is on the cover of Manfredo Tofuri's Utopia, Capitalism and Utopia. And then in the middle, you have the famous Pruitt-Igoe demolition, which is an image that appears over and over and over again in the history of postmodernism, most famously made in reference to like Charles Jenks, right? And then on the right, you've got the House of the Suicide and Mother of the House of the Suicide by John Haydock, which is a kind of poetic, let's say, homage to death in general. And so these three images, I think, to me, are different deaths that create these grand narratives. And especially in architectural discourse, these are referred to as these, sort of bigger paradigm shifting images, and especially the Pruitt-Igoe image, right? And so I started thinking about like, well, what is the architecture of destruction? And to me, it seems that architecture and destruction are very politicized, right? So just as Shahin was saying that the diner counter can be politicized, I think images of destruction can definitely be politicized. And one thing that I think is often omitted, for instance, when people quote Charles Jenks from the language of postmodern architecture, when he says that modern architecture died during the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe, he then goes on to say that Pruitt-Igoe had also been vandalized and sort of destroyed by its Black inhabitants. Right, and people don't really quote that in full, and they don't show that Charles Jenks was sort of portraying the Black inhabitants of Pruitt-Igoe in a negative light. And so, what my piece it looks at is the imagery of architectural destruction in popular media and in sort of related to contemporary events, so contemporary protest activity, for instance. So if you go to the next slide. When I talk about pop culture and vigilantes, I mean, immediately you can think of the superhero genre. I think Germane was alluding to this idea that superheroes are afforded a lot of privilege, right? Especially white superheroes, they are afforded the privilege to destroy. And destruction, this kind of urban destruction that is portrayed in the movies is usually called collateral damage, right? And what I think a lot of us kind of fail to acknowledge is that collateral damage is a politicizing phrase, right? It's a political designation because damage is not neutral. The only people that can claim something is collateral damage are the people who are telling the story, that they get to say, you know, what was destroyed in the service of some better, some higher good, or with you know, a bigger plan in the works or something like that, right? So the Avengers, Hulk, he can smash as much as he wants because he's the good guy, right? Any damage that is caused by the Avengers is typically labeled as collateral. Any damage that's done by the bad guys is usually called terrorism, right? And if you guys need any kind of example of how these images of destruction are politicized, we need only look back to 9/11. And we look at the images that were flooding media outlets after the terrorist attacks in 9/11, and especially that phrase, right? They were portrayed as this just like heinous act of terror. And those images of destruction were supposed to do two things. They were supposed to, you know, sort of captivate American resilience, right? They were supposed to say, you know, this is how we can get united. And this is how, you know, we will persevere. We are a USA strong or whatever. But they were also supposed to fuel vengeance. They were supposed to fuel retaliation, most famously, you know, resulting in the war on Iraq, right? Which is still going, right? And so these images were constantly providing these messages of vengeance, right? We need to retaliate. We need to avenge New York, right? And so if we fast forward to today, next slide, please. We see that there is another type of destruction and damage occurring in urban environments, this time perpetuated primarily by protesters, right? Protesters who are trying to call attention to injustice and racism. And so you have images in online and in the news outlets that portray you know, protesters throwing Molotov cocktails, smashing windows, and those images are followed by words like looting, rioting. You know, some articles, I think in USA Today said that George Floyd protesters were taking advantage of the peaceful protest, and they were rioting and using the protest as an excuse. And so those narratives are coming out of the, you know, the politicization of damage, right? And so the piece that I've been working on contrasts the privilege that's afforded to white superheroes, primarily the Avengers, and the fact that the people that are fighting for injustice today, you know, right now, by smashing windows, calling attention to injustice, they're not afforded that same privilege, right? They are portrayed as thugs. They're literally called thugs, right? They're told that they are destroying their own community, right? These are the phrases that follow this type of destruction. And it's such a stark contrast. And so, you know, one way of looking at it, which I suggest in my essay, is that we can analyze, like through close analysis, the superhero genre, right? So we can look at comic books and we can look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe and just compare and contrast the treatment of that kind of damage to the damage that is happening right now in real life, right? And we'll see, for instance, that the damage done to New York in the first Avengers movie is so great, but then everyone sort of moves on and they say, oh no, they saved the world, right? It doesn't matter if they destroy all of these skyscrapers, they can still, they're the good guys, right? But when it comes to, for example, portrayals of African countries, like in the movie Black Panther, it seems like there isn't the same amount of destruction in movies that feature Black superheroes. And so why is that? Like if you compare shot for shot, for example, Age of Ultron and Black Panther, the level of destruction is incomparable. In Black Panther, there's maybe like a car that blows up or a wall that's torn down. But in Age of Ultron, there's like a giant city that collapses on in Eastern Europe. And so why is it? Is it somehow that somebody's making an assumption that that damage caused by Black superheroes won't be accepted by the general public? Like that's a question that definitely should be out there, because the contrast is there. And so that is essentially what I'm interested in. And, I'm looking at the way that images of destruction, architectural destruction, are politicized and how they're presented to us through pop culture, right? Through these things that we watch as kids and grow up, admiring and just seeing kind of everywhere.
Thank you, Gallo, and thank you, Anjali. I'm pretty sure I speak for both Germane and myself. I mean, we're so excited for these conversations to come out in your pieces, hearing your work about your work right now, and looking forward to the Moss context issue. What we're going to do now is we have a set of questions for you both based on what you just presented and also coming into this lecture. And after that, we'll turn it over to a question and answer with the audience. One thing that we want to start this off with is trying to understand, Gallo, this really comes on the heels of what you're presenting, what we've been talking about as avatars, but different roles that vigilantism occupies. And, one way of thinking about this is there are those who are aggressors and those as resistors, and also the witnesses as these three very distinct roles with very different politics and agency, but all act as vigilantes in some way. And I'll back up just a quick second to give a working definition of vigilantism and vigilante for our audience. A vigilante is somebody who takes police powers that are usually defined by and sanctioned by the state into their own hands. So if we police our neighborhood in a voluntary capacity, but we haven't been deputized to do so, we become vigilantes by one definition. If you think about the origin of the word, it comes from vigilance, and it's connected to the idea of vigils, but this idea of watchfulness. And so if I can ask Anjali and Gallo to maybe share some thoughts in your work and in what you just shared in your stories, how might you distinguish between those roles of the aggressor, the resistor, and the witness? And is that a significant distinction for thinking about vigilantism in this context, in the context of architecture that you all present?
Well, one thing I want to call out that I think there's a fourth party here, and that both Gallo and I sort of touch on, and that's the narrator. And for me personally, like my problem with landmarks as a product of preservation is that the narrator is unreliable. So I always found the people who create monuments, the people who create landmarks, as having like one certain type of history, one certain view of history. And I spent some time while writing this piece rereading Sarah Schulman's The Gentrification of the Mind to remind myself that, there's a whole kind of group of people who exist happily in the world with a kind of an understanding or sort of a bad understanding or an incorrect understanding of history, or how history sort of functions. And so for me, like the narrator is kind of like the most crucial part, as we have like the actor, for me, is sort of anyone who wants to take upon themselves an opportunity to build a landmark or a monument to themselves to either assert or correct histories. But really trying to tackle the idea that when when it comes to creating landmarks, the state and bureaucratic control, oftentimes a different narrative is created. And whether or not you're fighting against that narrative, or you're trying to create a new one, or you're trying to expose one that hasn't been seen before, is sort of a key part of that. And honestly, relying on the bureaucratic nature of the state isn't always the most effective, nor is it the least racist way to go about it.
Yeah, I definitely agree, right? The Marvel movies that I'm sort of closely critiquing are the epitome of an unreliable narrator, right? I mean, the way that the initial comic books are adapted, that's one level of translation, right? And then also just the way that the superheroes sort of assert their mission is very sort of nebulous and vague, right? So, you know, in Captain America, when it first came out in 1940, Captain America was shown punching Hitler, right? That is a very, very clear distinction of good and bad, right? Captain America is good, Hitler is bad. Let's just, you know, kick his ass. But, you know, as they evolve, the superhero comic books became a lot more nuanced. And I think that was evident in like Watchmen. And so it was less clear to see who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, right? So now you've got all of these narratives of flawed superheroes, right? And so the vigilantes that used to have a very clear mission now have a very vague mission. And so I think this idea, the network of relationships between the narrator, the characters, and then the witnesses and the reader as well, is all a lot more complex right now, I think, and especially when it comes to like studying comic books as literature, right? And so, for example, I've been researching a comic book critic, Adilifun Nama, who wrote a book called Super Black about the history of Black superheroes. And he basically starts off by saying that superheroes like Superman, the big ones that are like white and all powerful, their main mission is to preserve the status quo, right? And so they're always fighting something that has shifted the status quo, and their impulse is to just like, let's go back to where it was, right? They're never seeking out injustice and sort of avenging that injustice, right? They're always reacting to something else. And so you can't expect superheroes to solve like systemic racism. They're not going to come into the mayor's office and solve redlining, right? Because their goal is really just to react. And so if you start to critically analyze superheroes, their character, who's telling their stories, then all of a sudden, I think we have some more complex narratives to both learn from, but to also critique.
I'd like to jump in for a second, because when Shahin and I sort of crafted the issue and sort of the thought process behind vigilantism, like I gave the story behind me jokingly saying, "Stop trying to be Batman." Right? Like, why do people keep trying to do this? And Shahin used the word vigilante for the first time in January, right? This is before the protests. This is before the world caught on fire, right? And so now we think about ways that we ourselves act as vigilantes. And so I want to direct this towards Anjali, the Purple House, right? You're literally acting as a vigilante in your own neighborhood as a way to create what you're saying as the landmark, to create a sense of belonging within areas of disorientation. So can you tell us more specifically, how do you view yourself as a vigilante? Do you consider yourself an aggressor or a resistor or a narrator or as a witness?
Oh man. Well, that's difficult because I think a lot of what I'm sort of talking about is tied up in a lot more, well, just like a lot of kind of political issues surrounding it, right? Like it's private property, you know, it's sort of like, this is my house. So there's like that layer of kind of weirdness to it. And when I was talking to Roberto Bedoya about this, you know, he brought up the idea of the rascache, like the aesthetic of the underdog, and, you know, in Oakland, how it sort of looks like homes that are decorated with shoes and found objects, and really sort of asserting that like someone lives here, and this is this type of person who lives here. And while I sort of love that, I also understand that this is, you know, it's sort of caught up in the issue of private property. But specifically speaking, for a long time, I think that when I was living in Chicago, I was a witness, and I was mostly a witness to displacement and gentrification. And when I decided to buy this house, I built up enough anxiety, I think, about kind of perpetuating the cycle of being a gentrifier. So that way, instead of being someone who was reacting to that, I decided that I was just going to accept it and at least try to offer something. I can be a good neighbor, I can love my neighborhood, and I can care for it. But in this way, like acting as a vigilante feels, it feels less extreme because it's my house. I'm not subject to necessarily the law, and we don't have like an HOA or, you know, some big group of people who are going to tell me to stop or take it down. But I think that going from being a witness to being essentially a reactor to my own anxieties and my own internalized fear of oppression, the one thing I could do is this one small gesture. And that's why I feel like in the situation of the piece that I'm writing is that vigilantism doesn't look like, in this case, it doesn't look like, rapid organizing of people to police neighborhoods when the actual police won't do it or do it poorly. It's more of a, how can we turn a gesture into an act of vigilantism? I'm looking at like moments of tenderness and looking at sort of opportunities for invitation to participate. You know, I use that image of the ghost bike, right, which created simultaneously a memorial, a monument, an opportunity to tell a story, a place to rally for bike safety in Chicago, and kind of a church. You know, there were people for weeks doing, like the rosary on site to pray for the woman who died there. And these small gestures and gestures of tenderness, I think, are what unexpected vigilantism. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it definitely does, and I think it's a great it's a great way to lead me to Gallo, because when you and I, Anjali, talked earlier, we spoke about in Chicago, Fred Hampton's house,
Yeah,
and how the goal to get it designated as a historical landmark,
mm-hmm.
and the red tape that it takes to go through the historic preservation in the city to make that happen, so that those in the neighborhood just did it on their own. They said, we'll make it a landmark. We'll take the matters into our own hands, right? So, liberatory form of vigilantism. Whereas typically we hear the word vigilante and we think immediately negatively.
Yeah.
Something that's brought with tenderness is rarely something that's brought with happiness, is rarely something that's brought with preservation or celebratory gestures, right? Unless you're a superhero. If you're a superhero, you do whatever the hell you want to do. You can be a vigilante. It doesn't matter. You can, unless you have your John Jonah Jameson with the newspaper, the Daily Bugle, saying man is a mark on the society, everyone loves you, right? So Gallo, my question to you now becomes, how does this trope of the superhero begin to influence individuals within their own communities, whether it be a suburb or a co-op or a Starbucks, to be a superhero? And we don't need it.
Well, I mean, the trope is so ingrained in American culture, right? I mean, superheroes were reinvented over and over again through the 20th century, right? You had the first, I think it's like the golden age of superheroes, which is like the 40s. It's when Captain America and you know, the US was fighting a very visceral evil, right? And then they resurged again in the 1960s. And they started to become more popular. And so that's, I think, when, you know, kids really started to latch on to this image of the superhero as a vigilante, right? The masked, some kind of a masked hero. And it's almost as if rule for becoming a superhero was to don a mask. And as soon as you put on the mask, then you're afforded all kinds of privilege, unless for some reason you had a different color skin, and that was visible, right? Then all of a sudden you are labeled a threat. And so the mask didn't work for everyone, right? And what I think is kind of interesting about the superhero genre is that Marvel and DC started to introduce more fallible superheroes, like more complex. So it was no more Superman, right? Who just like has ultimate strength. But it was more, people that had accidents, and then they were given that responsibility. And so I guess the question is, how do we engage this medium critically, so that when you're talking to kids and kids are watching these movies and they start to associate costumes with justice, right? How do you say, well, there's a lot more to it than that. These are individuals that are not perfect. They're not gods, even though some have the narrative of being a god. How do you instill that sense of sort of criticality in like a little kid genre, right? I think that's the kind of tension, right? I don't really know, but I think it's important to be aware that even the things that we take for granted, like popular movies, are ingrained in political rhetoric. Yeah.
This is all so helpful to hear, and I'm thinking about your points in the context of Dean Williamson's introduction to the series and some of the goals of this series, and I'm thinking about even the vigilantism involved there. So I'm pivoting this and bringing it back to the context in which we're in right now, some of this conversation, and to our audience and the students at Texas Tech. And I'll do this maybe perhaps as a last question, unless anything comes up that we want to talk through here before turning it over to Stephanie to engage our audience. But I think that a point you made, Dean Williamson, one of the themes about practice, I think is, I'm hearing inspirations from what you just said, Gallo, and Anjali, what you were saying in your own work, for example, you were sharing with your house. I wonder if you both can share with us maybe reflections on ways you think we as architecture students can take this idea of vigilantism to empower our confrontation with, say, the racism of architectural institutions. And I even see this lecture series as a form of resistance or a form of witnessing some of the perpetuation of racism that happens in different structures of architectural education, kind of the knowledge we uphold and celebrate, like in Germane's false prophets session, there was a direct critique of that. So I wonder if you all can translate some of your ideas to a reflection that maybe leads us to the audience reflecting on their own vigilance and what kinds of vigilantism could be empowering now as we confront social problems that have become overtly and contentiously political.
It's funny, I don't know, you asked that, but I feel like in many ways, like I didn't go to architecture school. I went to journalism school in the context of an art institution that had an architecture school. So I feel like in a lot of ways, I too have donned a mask and have been given great powers to publish things in outlets that have opinions. And so I don't know, I feel like architecture school is very complicated because you're given this opportunity while in school to sort of work outside of institutions that are not like government, right? So if you're working within the institution of school, which has its own rules and regulations and politics, et cetera, but you don't have to get drawings planned and stamped and processed and approved. You don't have to go through like the zoning board. You don't have to necessarily do all of that. But my recommendation is that you somehow find your way into these institutions, because you have to find a way to subvert them. The issues that I've always had working around, near, or adjacent to architects is that they have long since abandoned their imagination for subversion, and that there isn't a spark of imagination left once they have started going through the processes of the Zoning Board of Appeals or the Landmarks Committee, that they're all so kind of spent their time bogged down by Revit that they've lost sense of what it precisely, like being able to identify precisely the spaces in which they have flexibility to push boundaries and to do things without permission, to act without permission, or to push those lines of permission. So do that now, find out where those spaces of those pressure points are, where those places of flexibility are in the city that you're in now. I think understanding bureaucracies is going to be critical, right? Like the best thing I ever learned in undergrad was how to stand in a line. Because, after that I could do kind of anything. I had patience, I had unbelievable patience. But anyway, I think that like understanding bureaucracies as students gets you to a place where you can see where lines can get pushed, where pressure points are, where you can deviate. And little moments of vigilantism, I think, are welcome once you move into the professional world.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point, especially in the context of architecture school, because I think Germane's project is that he presented at ECSA is amazing, because it asked us to kill our heroes, right? And the Charles Jenkses, the Le Corbusiers, all of the people that have been put up on a pedestal, who are basically the superheroes of architecture, need to be taken down, right? And I think that your mention of the scale of like little moments of vigilantism is healthy, right? That's exactly the kind of scale at which maybe the vigilante can work at, right? I don't think that the vigilante has to be a Bjarke Ingels, wearing a costume, right? Because that perpetuates the exact same system that we already know fails. Like we've identified the failure of that heroic figure. And so if architecture schools can just be willing to kill their heroes and start at a different scale, then we can, I think, be a lot more productive and equitable, I think, just in our approach to design, right?
Yeah, you can't break rules if you don't know what the rules are. And so I think that's, people expect you to do that once you leave school, right? You're learning the rules of design now, but what you're going to run up against is you're going to run up against the rules of bureaucracy. You're going to run up against the rules of zoning. Learn what those are now. Try to find the soft places, where you can hide your good intentions, your vigilante intentions. There isn't a whole lot of space in the professional world for that type of kind of like radical imagination than you have right now.
Awesome. So we'll conclude this portion of the talk, and we'll happily welcome Ms. Delgado in to lead the rest of our discussion.
Hi, everybody. That conversation was amazing. I love this idea of killing your heroes, because it's really critical to where we are today. It's really critical with the current conversations happening with Black Lives Matter. You guys answered a question that I already had. One of the things that I find quite interesting in this conversation is the idea of distinction. This idea that there's really a good versus bad, especially in superhero movies. The idea that there has to be a way to fight back. You answered it towards the end, this idea that when can vigilantism not be a reaction? When is it not a moment of questioning? Because as you were saying earlier, you have to learn the rules. So rules are automatically a reaction. Like breaking the rules is a reaction to the rules. When we see this in Captain America Civil War, which I find to be one of the better Avengers movies, they're being questioned. They're like, you're not allowed to do this without respecting everybody else. And you have like Captain America being kind of obvious as a United States representative saying like, no, you can't control me. So there's a strong distinction about who can control who when it comes to vigilantism. So, when can we not react? When is as vigilantes, as I hope all of us become, as we fight for a more socially just society, when are we not reactors? Or can we never not be reactors?
Well, I don't know. I think that's why for me, like, as Germane sort of said, that I'm sort of approaching this as like, what does a rogue celebration look like? Like, what does rogue vigilante tenderness look like? How do you build that into your community? How do you help people physically feel the tenderness that you feel for your block or your neighborhood? Because there's no way in heck the city of Chicago is going to give me permission to do anything that would celebrate tenderness, because I need to pay a permit to close my block to have a block party, and I'm not going to do that either, because it's expensive. But so there's like, to me, I feel like that type of vigilantism it's not a reaction to anything other than how you feel about where you are. And initially, right, when we're creating these landmarks and monuments to ourselves, what we're doing is it's reaction to gentrification and displacement. You know, I'm couching in that. But I feel like once the ball is rolling, once you have that permission, people feel like they have the permission to continue with this practice of building monuments to themselves or the people they love, the people who cared for their children, the children themselves. It'll become more of a mainstay that this is an opportunity rather than a reaction.
I'll hop in with a thought too. Anjali, what you said is really, oh gosh, I'm so excited for conversations. These are really fascinating points. Stephanie, what a cool question. And I'm feeling not imaginative. So my response is maybe not productive, but here's the first thing that I think is, again, thinking about institutions and the institutional context of things. If we think about institutions, the definition I'm working with is structures that guide our behavior and the ways we think and do things. So architecture curriculum is an institution. Architecture licensure is an institution. Even the American Institute of Architects is an institution. These all shape and guide ways we do architecture, say. Institutions like architecture or law, thinking about that law school building, in the US, particularly in the context of racism, are so embedded in patriarchal and racist histories that I struggle to see ways that one can be neutral. And Howard Zinn has this great book, How to Be Neutral on a Moving Train.
No, you can't be neutral.
You can't be neutral on a moving train. Yes, exactly. And a big part of it are his memoirs of coming up as a teacher and professor in the civil rights era. And he's constantly challenged by his academic institution as a faculty person, first at Spelman and then Boston University. And what it connects to is this idea of civil disobedience as necessary in an institutional context where our institutions are racist. And what I hear him and many others saying is that this train is moving. This is a racist train, this structure. And if you don't see it, you're feigning neutrality, or you're being colorblind, or you're not seeing the racism inherent in it. So thinking about Stephanie's really interesting provocation, I fail to see ways of being vigilant that that are not reactionary. It's not that we're being reactionaries in a negative sense. We're reacting to a set of systems and structures that are deeply problematic and actively problematic and forcefully problematic and violently problematic. Whether we see that or not connects to our privilege. So that's just a not useful thought in response to a really great question.
You know, what I appreciate about your answer, Shawhin, and also Angelis, especially with your Shawhin, is that you're talking about something that, sorry if I mispronounced her name, Angelu? I'm sorry, and same with Shawhin. It's a conversation that we had, or you guys had a little bit earlier, where it was about the narrator. This idea of the unreliable narrator, and the way that you're kind of talking about Shawhin and Angela is that we're basically in a narrative that's with an unreliable narrator. Like, we didn't write this story, we're just in it. So we're characters of the story that we're currently facing. So how, as we as characters, as we were in the superhero movie, how are we like vigilantes? And I find that provocation to be really interesting. There's a question in the chat from Chris Taylor. Curious if Kerry James Marshall and his Rhythm Master comic series factors into all of this. He added a link, which I will answer live so that way everybody can see it. Are there models that move beyond mainstream entertainment, or is working from that baseline important?
Is this directed towards any of us or towards Gallo?
I think anybody. Chris, sorry, I accidentally deleted the link.
I can jump in first.
Yeah.
And specifically the mainstream entertainment portion of the question, but which I think is probably the most applicable to how we're framing vigilantism and how sort of the theme of the conversation today works in conjunction with that. So meaning until we acknowledge the fact that the narrator, as Shahin, we now have to add this fourth avatar, the narrator is now a part of the conversation. That's who determines what's successful in the mainstream and what's unsuccessful in the mainstream. So using Black Panther as an example, as Gallo brought up before, you've never seen a movie on the scale of that with that many Black individuals and Black directors and Black makeup artists and costume designers, because the narrator always assumed that that genre would not be successful, because those who do not identify as Black would not go and fill theaters to see it. Removing the fact that many individuals who may identify as Black wouldn't see the other films because they weren't reflected, right? So it becomes a situation of you're marginalizing one, prioritizing the other, but then when you subvert that and you bring these individuals to the forefront, then you don't lose any money. You actually gain money, because now you have those who are already entrenched within the culture of comic books, but also those who you completely excluded now have the door open for them as well. So if we move this to the context of academia, one could assume that those who are often pushed to the boundaries, those who are often relegated to the sidelines, if we were to move them into these positions of power, into these locations to where they can make movement and make decisions, we'll see a more equitable version, which then doesn't have to be reactionary, right? So it all still brings itself together, because then the mainstream is expanded. It's not isolated to one small subset of individuals.
I'd like to see a superhero movie. I don't know actually anything really about superhero movies, but I feel like there's this whole part of the institution that I think is where you have a vigilante, someone on the sidelines, someone who's working rogue, who then becomes loved and adored, and then they get absorbed by the institution. You know, the critique of the institution becomes the institution of critique. And like what happens then? Like what happens to that sort of power? Then that person gets absorbed into the institution and they themselves become the law. Who then sort of replaces them in that sort of vigilante role? Who then becomes they become the narrator, so everyone else becomes an opportunist to take control.
Right. I mean, there's the there's the kind of popular quote from Batman, where they said, "You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become a villain." Right. And it's the problem of these binaries, right? And I think that's why Captain America: Civil War touches on the complexities of, or is good because it touches on the complexities of the heroes, right? It basically builds off of the narrative of Watchmen, when superheroes have to be held accountable. Because if you have heroes that are so grandiose, they are inevitably gonna become villains at some point, right? And so that's why I think that the scale of the vigilante is so important, because I don't think you can have a vigilante that grows to become such a powerful person, because then they become an institution, right? And so, you know, I think it's kind of interesting to see if something operates as a vigilante at a small enough scale, then it can be kind of productive. But
you see that with politicians, right? Like
yeah.
You see that with like politicians who begin as kind of like vigilante, like the everyman rises up, and then 20 years later they're still in power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And while that might not be fiction, certainly in Chicago it is the reality. I mean, I guess the one thing I kind of wanted to bring up, since Germane brought up the Fred Hampton conversation that we had, is the thing that I've always been really interested in about the narrative about Fred Hampton, who was Chairman Fred of the Black Panther Party. His headquarters was about a mile away from my house and is now a Walgreens parking lot. So I always thought about, like, what are the vigilante ways that I could turn this into a monument? And it's interesting now because there's actually a movie coming out about Fred Hampton's life and assassination. And so I'm sort of wondering, like, how the presence of the movie in popular culture is going to shift that sort of contemporary idea of Fred Hampton being a vigilante or an activist who fed people and gave people vigilante medical care throughout the late 1960s, was how that might sort of be turned into a hero's narrative. That's an unusual line for me to kind of imagine, like the hero versus the vigilante, versus where a lot of people who are still in Chicago, who are very much alive, still see him as being quite lawless, operating outside of the margins, despite the fact that his movement was quite mainstream and served thousands of people. So I'm excited to see how pop culture sort of moves that narrative.
I think we have enough time for one more question. So Jackie Valverde asked, with the recent death of the actor Chadwick Boseman, the Black Panther, how do you feel this has affected Black America and his role in vigilantism?
I'll just say very, very briefly. I didn't realize how much it was actually going to emotionally affect me finding out that he passed away. Having lost a sibling to cancer, it immediately made me just brought that up to me. But then the other part is he played so many iconic roles as the hero, right? He was every single film he played, he was the hero. And if we continue to talk about killing our heroes, then what does that mean when you reproduce, right? And it really means that the mantle of the hero is one that should be shared. It's not one that should be held by a single individual. So the hope is that in his death, a new hero may emerge, and then so on and so forth, and then we see that. And so I guess I'll close out my portion by answering one of the gentlemen who asked, what do we say to the students? And I would implore to the students, having just been one 10 years ago, you have to ask questions. You got to push boundaries. You have to be brave. You have to be brave. You have to be willing to put yourself out there and do the work and put yourself forward and put other people forward so that you can have an equitable future. And those are those small, tender moments of vigilantism that we try to find.
I think we're going to sort of wrap it up, and I want to thank everyone for participating. But if you don't mind, I'd like to make one comment. The word narrative has come up over and over in various forms. Whether we're talking about the narrative of various movies or certain cultural narratives that are being ignored or always already assumed to be there. Last week we had a conversation with a student group called Dialogues, and I made the observation, I'm going to make it here again, that right now the predominant narrative within architecture is one based upon service. You know, that it's a service industry, and that what we are to do is somehow serve a client as best we can, and often without perhaps being able to question some of the presumptions that that client has, because, well, that would be endangering a commission. I know for a fact, however, that there are corporate firms now looking at social justice as something that they really do need to deal with. So on one hand, there are people within large corporate firms that are beginning to understand that the power of that corporate firm to engage in some of these issues is actually considerable. But whether or not they will remain there is another matter. But the thing I think that is really important is that students need to realize that this narrative of a service profession, where we don't get involved in issues of politics, for example, it is really something that needs to be dismantled and needs to be criticized. The idea that we are at the service of a narrative which someone else writes, and that we have no role in writing, is really damaging to the way that we can leverage our positions as architects. I'd go back to some of the people that Gallo presented earlier, and whether it's Rossi or Hayduk, these were people that deliberately tried to rewrite the narrative of architectural practice and engage in particular issues. Certainly Hayduk, and I mean, I know that project particularly well, of Hayduk's that you brought up, Gallo. I don't know how many people may know it, but it's ultimately a monument to a young man who set fire to himself in the central part of Prague to protest oppression. And that's important. And it's important that that architects realize that they have to, in a way, ally themselves with the powerful critiques of our culture, rather than align themselves with the prevalent or predominant narrative of our culture. So I'm sorry, I'm probably lecturing a little bit, but
no, that was great.
Really important.
That was great.
Amazing.
Oh. All right. So look, thank you, everyone. I really, really do appreciate you all participating. I think it's really, really quite fantastic that we begin this series with 5 different participants, 5 very different backgrounds, and I hope we can continue the kind of multiplicity of voices in the conversations throughout the semester and throughout the year. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.